Good afternoon and welcome to the Society of Light and Lighting's Trotter Paterson Lecture 2020. The Society, the SLL, have been putting on lectures and talks about light and lighting for many years, and the most prestigious one is the Trotter Paterson that's been given since 1951 biannually. Past speakers have included Sir Lawrence Bragg, Sir Solly Zuckerman, Sir Eric Laithwaite, Professor John Mollen, and in the past few years, Bernie Davis, the TV lighting director, Professor John Barber, Professor Mark Rea, the neurobiologist Sir Colin Blakemore, and the lighting researcher Professor Peter Boyce. I'm sitting here at the lighting console at the Open Air Theatre in Regent's Park. And what's so great about this lighting desk is the fact that it's actually switched on. Because later on today, there's going to be a performance of Jesus Christ Superstar. This theatre in Regent's Park, plus the Minack Theatre in Penzance, are two of the very few that are actually open at the moment due to the lockdown. This is a small shoot of good news in this quite bleak time. Fitting then that our speaker today is Paule Constable, one of the world's leading theatre and opera lighting designers. She has won a Tony Award twice, and in 2005 she won an Olivier Award for Best Lighting, and she's gone on to win it 3 more times. Her shows include Ocean at the End of the Lane, Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night, The Chalk Garden, Warhorse, His Dark Materials and Follies. She recently championed the lobbying of Parliament to gain £1.57 billion to help keep the arts establishment alive. So then, please welcome Paule Constable to give the 2020 Trotter Paterson Lecture.
Hello everybody, thank you for joining us. I wanted to talk about the art of the story. I love light. I'm sure most of us do in this Zoom room. That mercurial and precious element that can change the air, create a roar, an in-breath. Secret yet oh so showy, elusive, beautiful and brutal. But as much as I love light, I love story more. I love imposing a structure on otherwise unfathomable elements, creating beginnings, middles and endings so that others can follow. I'm drawn to finding the perfect essence of something and am often, as a result, accused of an Amish approach to design. I love stripping things down. My work is rigorous, extreme, and often very, very simple, which is unsurprising, I suppose. I'm actually a literature graduate with no formal lighting training beyond A-level physics and maths, more obsessed with the language of ideas than with lights themselves. My work is more about darkness than light, more about what isn't there, what can be imagined, and the collective act of storytelling. So I want to talk about stories, which means that I should start at the beginning, perhaps with my personal story. But before that even, let's talk about context, where my story begins, the lighting landscape that I met in the late 1980s in London, and forgive a rather simplistic précis. I'm one of the few women in the UK of my generation who does this job, not the only one, but one of the few. I turn lights on and off in the world of opera, musical theatre, dance and drama. I'm certainly one of the very few fortunate enough to be working at the level that I do. Finally, the landscape is shifting and there are more young women, more practitioners from marginalised communities coming into this world, but we have much work to do in this area, which is strange because, particularly as regards questions of gender, this stage lighting design tradition, the world of dramaturgical large-scale lighting, was in many ways developed through 3 American giants, Tom Skelton, Farron Musser, Jean Rosenthal, and 2 of the 3 were women. Because what in the 50s were the skills that you needed to be a lighting designer? What created the language of Broadway and stage lighting as complex as we see now? Quite literally, you needed to be good at managing a physical technology, specifically a switchboard. In her book, The Magic of Light, Jean Rosenthal talks about many skills she developed through her design studies and her journey. But the one she talks about a lot, with much fondness, is her time as the lighting switchboard operator in the theatre. She solved problems, she painted with light, she breathed life into objects, spaces, people, into images. And she talks a lot about communication, about normalizing the complexities, about collaboration, about painting. In the early days of her career, she was rarely even credited as the lighting designer, but she was just that, because she was the one who made the decisions, who faded the lights, who responded to the director, who created the stage pictures. Thus she became one of the small group who developed the language of complex interpretative theatre lighting design, design that wasn't merely about illumination. She's even considered a pioneer by Wikipedia, as is Tharum. Those early Broadway shows, the musicals of the 70s, were more often than not created by one of these two women. They were top of their game and no one batted an eyelid. It wasn't considered an unusual role for a woman. In the UK, we lagged behind a bit, and when lighting designers began to emerge, they came from a tradition of chief electricians. So already being tech-based meant the overwhelming number were men. And then lighting became more and more about technology. It was hijacked, mainly through the influence of rock and roll. It became about hard living, hard touring, riggers and lampies. How tough are you? As rock and roll technology moved into our world, so their attitudes started to shift across as well. LDs were no longer seen as enablers, artists, collaborators, but much more as gatekeepers to technology. Lighting started to be about stuff. It made it sexy, macho, and male. Whether conscious of the prejudice or not, most people wanted tech to be in the control of men. They felt reassured by looking over at the desk and seeing a man at the helm. So what then is my story? Well, I was partly driven by a childhood dream to be Lieutenant Uhura from Star Trek, and by a lifelong terror and fascination with the dark. And I came into this tech-driven world. A chance situation as a student, and I found myself as a follow spot operator on a small show in London, where Midnight Design were in charge of the lighting. It was a rock show musical. I turned up, blissful in my ignorance, but full of attitude and an aptitude for playing with technology and a love of climbing, anything. I rapidly started to whip up trusses and help out, eventually being taken on as a sort of apprentice as I finished my degree in drama and English at Goldsmiths College. I'd stumbled across something perfect in Midnight Design. Dave Bryant, one of the partners, had grown up in theatre. His rock and roll and event design was uniquely informed, and despite having turned his back on the conventional world of theatre, he carried the spirit of collaboration and interpretation with him. He really was a designer, and I loved watching him work. It was the first time I witnessed the alchemy of light. Any one of us could put lights up, add them to a gig, flash them a bit. But if Dave was there, the light did something different. It moved, it added depth, it shocked you, it drew you in, it engaged you. I was hooked. By then, I'd met my partner, who worked in experimental theatre. Our worlds were different but parallel. Eventually, he was working on shows that could do with my skill set, as rigging and trussing came to be part of the world of theatre more and more. I started to meet his tribe of artists, particularly a lighting designer called Stevie Whitson. Stevie was a New Yorker. He'd worked at La Mama at the factory. He was anarchic and brilliant. He played with light like a child, pushed boundaries. I rigged parkans for him at the end of 21-foot scaffolding poles, outrigged over the River Thames. I slid down the outside of big tops for him. I battled grumpy crews across Europe. But most of all, I watched him work. I watched him weave magic with light. And then came the day that he had a job that I wanted to work on, and he didn't ask me to do it. And I called him and asked him why, and he told me to go away and do my own work in that camp New York way. I was mortified. A year later, he was dead, lost to AIDS with too much still to offer, and I was still angry with him. And it took me years to understand the gift he gave me, his part in my story. But I did. I went and made my own work. and I didn't really understand that there was a prejudice against me. In rock and roll, the prejudices were overt. I remember the day that my crew chief asked a visiting band's lighting designer if I could focus the front truss for them on a tour. If she can, he laughed. I climbed the truss, worked my way from one end to the other, with around 18 men laughing at me as I worked on every lamp. I left for my first tour to find my toolkit labelled girly lampy makeup and cotton buds. And those were the gags. Worse was the general assumption that I couldn't do it. So I had to push myself to breaking point every day, and I carry the bruises to this day. So for me, the move into experimental theatre and fringe theatre felt liberating. There were amazing women techs and designers and managers and performers. Still in the minority, but at least there was a presence. In rock and roll, you could count the number of women I'd met on one hand. The world of fringe theatre in London in the late 80s was an underbelly, truly alternative, and gender was a battleground where we'd made more headway than in normal life, let alone in the mad world of music. I'd found my first safe space, somewhere I could learn to tell stories with light. So armed with a literature degree, some technical knowledge, a love of the parkan and a lot of attitude, I was discovering the possibilities of light. I was meeting directors and makers who were intrigued by me and happy to let me have a go. Theatre de Complicité, Katie Mitchell, Ray Smith, Vicky Mortimer, Matthew Bourne. We were all kids and we started to learn how to make together. Enough about my personal story. I'm going to move on to talk a bit about the meat of my work, what I think it is about, the middle, if you like. So what's so important about stories? How do they work? For a moment, can I just talk about the importance of story to us as humans? Let's consider dogs, their landscape. Their plane of survival is entirely dependent upon their noses. With their nose, they discover food, danger, sex, all they need to survive. Humans, we rely on understanding the minds of others. We grow food collectively, we cooperate, we negotiate sexual needs, we share information. We are a socialized species, domesticated. We need to understand the other members of our tribe, of our group, to survive. Therefore, our brains have become fine-tuned to both tell and understand stories, because stories have a unique way of educating, of illustrating the behaviours of us and of others, which is vital to our survival. Stories are not merely entertainment. They teach, they shift attitudes, they question. They are the stuff of life. But to tell stories, we need to communicate effectively. We need to capture the attention of our fellow humans. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt acknowledges that the brain itself is sadly not a very good logic processor. It's remarkably bad at detail and pieces together narrative from the snippets of information it can be bothered to take in. So to capture the attention, to focus the mind, something has to change, to shift. And this is so often the central premise of a great story, that something changes. A storyteller grabs the attention by creating curiosity, because this makes us really notice, see, listen. Without the moment of intrigue, of change, we don't really engage. So while this is of educational value, it's also proven that our brains enjoy the reward of this. We feel good as we piece something together, gain pleasure from the way something develops, and we remain engaged. And we can use this in theatre. For instance, we can create engagement through the gaps we leave, the things we ask the audience to add themselves. Warhorse was a show I made 12 years ago in the Olivier Theatre, part of the National Theatre in London. Through the workshops for the show and the development of the full-size horse puppets, it became clear that we were making something where we were going to be asking a lot of our audience. To succeed, we were asking them to engage with a puppet manipulated by 3 people made from bamboo and bits of bicycle, and that could only express through breath, tail swishing, and the movement of the ears. Warhorse is a story about an Edwardian, pastoral, nostalgic world being blown apart by the first truly man-made war, where shrapnel and metal and tanks blew men and animals up with a brutality that had never been seen before. Yet with our puppets and a script that demanded shifts from domestic to landscape, from pastoral to battlefield at the drop of a hat, we could never have imposed a literal scenic solution on the production. Now, let's hope that works then. So the space we developed was a vast open storytelling space, a beautiful floor that could shift with various angles of light and could transform from a ploughed field to a World War I battlefield. Above this, a simple torn strip floated, representing a cloud, a drawing, but also giving us a space that we could deliver horses and people through, and also, most importantly, to create darkness. Every shift in space, in place, in time, all that was created with light. Ray Smith, the set and costume designer, gave me a storytelling space, and light came in and told a story. It expressed the essence of something. Light coming from beyond clouds, gently touching a landscape, a golden, nostalgic light that reminds us, I hope, of summer days and the past. In contrast to the landscape of war, where the light that drains away and leaves you in a world without natural colours, where chemicals and acids attack you from low aggressive angles and make the horses so vulnerable, no longer solid, but skeletal, like ghosts. And darkness everywhere in the spaces beyond, where the audience can imagine the things we can't show. So we asked the audience to imagine a field, the past, the war, a tank. We suggested, hinted at things, tried to create the essence of them with sound, movement, gesture, and light. We put them in the picture. And we had no idea if it would work, but by the end, the theatre was full of the sound of weeping. And 13 years on, the show was still being played around the world until the pandemic shut all our theatres down. From the very young to the very old, Warhorse had a profound effect on almost everyone who saw it, because they really felt something. So I would claim that the effect for the audience was more profound because each of us had our own relationship and created our own vivid version of the horror of the battlefield. We grabbed clues and then our brains created the rest for ourselves. No one told anyone what to think. They got there themselves by piecing together snippets that we gave them and imagining the rest in the darkness and smoke. The audience felt they owned it. It was their experience, personal, painful, owned, participatory. We can also create this sense of active participatory ownership through game playing, as we learn through play as children, so we can be encouraged to engage better and in a more alive form through play in the way we make stories. We can create games in the theatre, and that way the brain is equally engaged, equally alive to possibilities. Here, I want to talk about a show where we created exposed, playful elements, so the game became the game of the show. Curious Incident was a production that started its life in the Dorfman Theatre, the smallest space at the National. Mark Haddon's original book is a whodunit. The boy in the centre of the story is creating a fiction around the events that happened to him, reflecting his love of Sherlock Holmes, his love of detective fiction. Like Christopher in his fictional book, I decided to light the show in a way that reflected the loves of the character. So Bunny Christie, the set and costume designer, and I developed the idea of the space the story was told in being a box of Christopher's own making. As someone on the spectrum, autism, Asperger's, it's non-specific, with a passion for space and technology, I imagined that Christopher would have loved technical theatre. The space, like Warhorse, is composite, every shift in place and time and event being made again with sound, projection, movement and light. But unlike Warhorse here, the elements are much more stated and in the realm of the audience. You can see the things we're using. We don't appear and disappear from darkness. We don't ask the audience to imagine what they can't see in the black beyond. We ask them to imagine in Christopher's world how he might express or make something. We create a playground of his imagination and let the audience in to enjoy the game. And like the mind of someone with autism, it's as if Christopher is controlling the things we can use. The palette is restricted, declared. The lights are all in view, rigged on a grid that perfectly reflects the shape of the space below. The rig was tiny, nothing is hidden. There are oversized pixels of light within the set. Video projectors nestled within the same grid, light boxes all around. We created a playground for Christopher and invited the audience in to be delighted. The rules are so simple that we can make them playful, but never out of control. except in the moments of the play where the experience for him is overwhelming, at which point the response to the box is the same or totally dark. Delight is as beguiling as creating gaps for the imagination to fill, another way of stimulating an active response from your audience, only this time it's to reflect the imagination of another, a boy on the spectrum, to spend time in his shoes. This form of collaborative theatre gives us endless storytelling possibilities. I was recently part of the team who created the stage version of Neil Gaiman's Ocean at the End of the Lane, again at the National Theatre. It was sort of the ultimate storytelling throwing down of the gauntlet. So you think you can tell a story? How's about creating a Gaiman sci-fi fantasy in a theatre? Ridiculous, really. Again, we didn't know if it were possible. The key, steered by our director Katie Rudd, was going to be collaboration, imagination, play, and risk. Like Warhorse and Curious, we were in a world where we couldn't literally represent any of the layers of reality or the myriad settings that the book required. The book was written for youngsters, so we also wanted to make something that felt playful, inclusive, and experiential. So the most appropriate space, yet again, was the smallest space at the National. But as a studio space, we couldn't make strong, imposing statements that might be scenically driven. We were going to be working in this landscape of the imagination again, where we constantly needed to surprise. Fantasy has to engage the imagination even more, take the audience on a journey, surprise, beguile, thrill, terrify. The scenic design develops into a composite space, this time small and intimate, where any shift is made with light again. Objects float in and out. We put the audience on three sides to bring the youngsters watching into the action. It's hard to create surprise when the audience is so on top of you, so we have to celebrate them being part of our game. And the baton has to be constantly passed, so the show never settles. Objects fly in, puppets appear, things appear to float. The ultimate theatricality shared and enjoyed by the audience, so again it feels playful, engaging. And ultimately the elements we used to tell the story were all shared and present. The playful nature of things arriving and disappearing, but constantly shifting, attempted to create the layers of Neil Gaiman's story, but also to keep the audience engaged and surprised. A piece of silk and some mirrored paper creates an entire ocean. A bundle of rags and sticks creates a monster. It was raw, alive, and the kids and adults screamed and gasped. I've rarely enjoyed watching previews so much, sitting above the audience, loving the play of the show, the alive theatrical nature of the objects being pushed and pulled, creating rooms, witches, monsters, other lands and oceans, all with light. Again, light, it shifted to create every space, every possibility. It changed the room. Look here, sleight of hand, big pictures and small, it breathed. Thus, when we change the picture, we create story and can then take an audience on a journey with us. In even just dimming the house lights, we're creating change, making a radical shift in the space we share. We take the audience by the hand and we take them on a journey, albeit using surprise or delight or curiosity to engage them and make them see, hear and feel more. That's our job. But this relationship between story and lights goes deeper to the very structures of story themselves. There are traditionally 5 elements that make up a well-made story, and I wondered about how each of these relates to my work with light. So the first one is considered setting, probably the easiest on the surface to talk about, the question of where we are, place, time of day, period. Blasted, for instance, the Sarah Kane play, where the setting is incredibly specific in the text. A hotel room, could be in the UK, could be former Yugoslavia, set around the time of the war. It needs to be anodyne, something familiar. For this production at the Lyric Hammersmith, we based the interior on a slightly upmarket Leeds hotel, the Queen's. The light fittings based on this real place. The interior has to deliver both a credible daytime and a nighttime. So all my ideas for the first 2 acts are based on this. Firstly, the daylight. I made my choices based on research of actual spaces, actual situations, searching for the quality of daylight that resonates in the right way for an audience. The net curtain behind which we can hide 30 source faux pas, the frosting on the windows that gives the right amount of breaking down, but also maintains that directional quality. It feels so familiar, so normal. It doesn't shout about the ideas behind what it is, but creates a reality that makes the audience feel comfortable. It's entirely familiar. And then the nighttime scenes, the domestic lamps, start with the actual light, the reality of the situation, and work from there. It feels simple, but also it needs to feel real, because at the end of the second act, there's an explosion. Something happens and the hotel disappears to leave an abyss. So to make the loss feel strong, the sense of place needs to be strong, acutely observed, using the real things that would be in the actual room. So you start by turning on the real lights, and then you ask yourself, how much else do you need to support the text? We all know that if you can't see, then you can't hear, but present an audience with a strong enough image, and they will engage. Then when we use these bedside lights, how can we fill in a way that keeps the sense of darkness, that keeps the sense of nighttime? So use the actual objects, the reality of the situation, and then look and see what more you need. So then, when the whole thing explodes, this same forensic sense of what something would be comes into play. The light objects, what are they now? If the walls were blown up, what's left? The lights of fire exits and security lights and emergency lights, a sense of light from a long way away, piercing the darkness, making the characters feel more isolated, more alone. I looked at images of buildings after bombs had dropped, films like The Hurt Locker, Welcome to Sarajevo, temporary, unstable, dangerous. Already we're learning loads and no object is added, no lighting gesture is made without knowing why. And then, of course, there's Rembrandt, the sense of almost religious ecstasy of figures in the dark, which felt perfect as a way to express the humanity that is left when so much is taken away. Much of this research happens in collaboration with the set designer. Real lights in a space, what we call practicals, are a great way to spread the story of the space into the quality of the light, and a great way to get conversation going around the space. How does it shift? If the story is scenically driven, how can light be a participant in this conversation? If there's a window and the light comes from there, how to push this to be thick and meaningful? If we're in a domestic situation, what would the lights actually have been? Do we need to reflect the truth of this or undermine it? The Red Barn was a play that was designed to be hyper-real, but also deeply unnerving, like the George Simenon novels it's based upon. Familiar, yet somehow not quite right. The practical lamps in the sets had to express the style of a 50s farmhouse in Connecticut, but the space also had to exist in a power cut. What is the source of the light then? The fire, the candles. The main room, pictured, also had to carry windows that could communicate a snowstorm and be the source of all light in a hugely exposing final scene. We can even use light to express the sense of period. Let's look at the contrast in styles between 2 images of Clybourne Park at the Royal Court. This first image shows the first half of the play, set in the late 50s. The practical light fittings in the room are period, but more important is the style of the lighting. Rather than pushing an image as being based on the period fixture in the room, we need to make the image feel more self-conscious, more declared. The use of footlights to give that slightly garish period feel. Also the colour being slightly warm and cinemoid. The light is pretty generic, flat. It covers the whole space. It came from watching Bewitched, early 60s US sitcoms. But then this same space has to shift to the 90s. So the finish in the space was shifted in a 15-minute interval, but also the quality and style of the light. It's harsh from one side, cool, aggressive. Darkness starts to play a part. It speaks of a more contemporary aesthetic. By instinct, artists, creators were constantly working out how the brain processes a sense of life, mimicking those patterns and structures, putting them on stage, creating rules that help the audience to go on the journey. That's one thing when we're talking about a more literal setting, as with Red Barn or Blasted, but quite another when we're talking about a composite design like Warhorse or indeed Pinocchio. With this show, our setting is hard to define. We're within the landscape of a fairy tale, a black floating space where changes are made through simple, naive objects entering the space and a shifting colour that reflects those objects. And yet, as it is naive, it doesn't feel as though it should be overt or plastic. There's an old-fashioned storytelling aspect to the aesthetic. Bob Crowley and I looked at Italian puppetry and picture books, talked about marionette theatres, using colour in simple, bold ways, looking at carny images and circus from the 50s. The colour comes from the objects on the stage. Light brings them to life, not the other way round. Objects, light bulbs mainly, bring magic and delight. It's a poor world. The second aspect of story I wanted to talk about was theme or style. As you can tell, I'm often a very active participant in the overall aesthetic of the storytelling, always trying to articulate the whole in a way that makes it greater than the sum of its parts, but also being respectful, developing ideas from within, not without. I suspect one of the biggest differences between me and many of the lighting designers in this room is the number of people I have to collaborate with on any project. Often set, costume, sound, composition, choreography, direction. On Warhorse, we were a creative team of 17. But the question of how active or passive light is in the conversation is one that needs to be asked at the earliest stage, and is more often than not a question of setting. If a piece is set in a room but needs 50 different versions of that room, and the scenery doesn't shift, then the lighting is going to have to work very hard, or the audience will end up confused. Warhorse couldn't have communicated the journey of the piece without the lighting. It had to be active. Sometimes the clue to this is within the piece itself. So when you read it, you can start to ask the questions from the very beginning. An example of this is Angels in America. Within the text, Tony Kushner is obsessed with the idea of the angels being the source of all electrical power in the world. As the angel moves towards us, near to bursting into our world, so the electricity becomes more unstable. Electricity needs to have an active presence, being in as many images as possible. It's a character in the piece, and it needs to develop as the fantasy of the play becomes stronger. So we're on a journey where electricity somehow has to be present in as many images as possible, which, seeing as the piece is set in New York City in the 80s, and we had the world of the Warriors and Luc Besson and Subway and early Spielberg and Star Wars to look at, was a joy. But that assumption, first from the playwright and then from the director, saying it was vital to the narrative, affected everything I did. There were practical lights everywhere, LED and neon edges. So as the revolves of the first play moved, there was an energy about their movement brought by the lights. Then these same lights could make the landscape, urban New York, or the world of Blade Runner and Vangelis, a world of poverty made good with a splash of colour. Then, as the set disappeared, so the practical elements remained, so that framework still held the world, even if the structures had gone. In contrast, sometimes the whole design can develop around a lighting idea, so the very space itself is light. Heisenberg by Simon Stevens was designed by Bunny Christie. Bunny was very interested in the world of James Turrell and the idea of the science of the piece. Simon's play is writing about an experiment where people who have nothing in common, like unlike particles, meet and are attracted. So the world had to be forensic and non-naturalistic, but we also needed to be able to shift the sense of place and the sense of space. We workshopped many ideas, but I was most interested in using even lead, a now obsolete technology that I think offers amazing possibilities. And then sometimes the themes of a piece are reflected in the light itself. So when I think about tropony opera, Vicky Mortimer, the set and costume designer, and I were looking for a way to make a contemporary London-style reading of the ideas of the Berliner ensemble, so a contemporary version of Brecht's world. Working out what the rules were and reclaiming them for now. What does the quality of light need to communicate a modern tropony opera? We watched footage of Brecht's work alongside gangster movies from London in the 60s, most notably Performance, and tried to echo the grunge of the period with a stark version of the theatrical ad hoc quality that Brecht employed. A sort of naive and blocky stated theatrical style of lighting. The third story structural element I'd like to talk about is plot. It's impossible to share as it requires moving footage. My least favourite way to reflect any of my own work. I always find video of any of my productions slightly mortifying. What's the story of the light in the space? We've mentioned this in all the examples above, how Warhorse moves from pastoral landscape to the vorticist landscape of war, how blasted has to shift between day and night in a mundane interior and then create the abyss. Points of change in visual story as well as spoken story are vital, as proven by neuroscientist Sophie Scott, eminent in this area. She's explored the fact that without change, we can't perceive. Our human perception is based on the idea of change. What is that? Is the beginning of a story. To keep the story alive, we need to keep the shifts happening, keep the space alive. Writers constantly use this. Mozart's Don Giovanni is a descent into darkness, from Zelina's wedding breakfast to his nighttime party where he's dragged to hell. Chekhov in Uncle Vanya, as we shift from day to the depths of night and the loss of hope. And he uses moments of change, dusk and dawn, as moments of revelation. Think of Moon for the Misbegotten, that revelation of the night before, or Sarah Kane's 448 Psychosis. Time shifts, the images shift. But if they're slow, they can make an audience lean in, hold their collective breaths, wait. And they are the moments when things happen. The long, slow sunset in Ibsen's Ghosts, you can make it last as long as the show itself. So unaware of what's changing, the audience are always witnessing change. The Weir, the Conor McPherson play, set in a rural Irish pub where each character tells a story. No cue when I made the show was quicker than 10 minutes. As we tried to make the space breathe around the actors, the audience to experience the ghost stories as we would around a fire, fixed on the speaker's face, drawn in by the hearth, always leaning in. So plot is about the story of the movement of the light, what it has to do to support the piece, but also the rhythm with which it does this. The above examples are slow, but there are the quick as well. Curious was quick. Ocean, we use speed of change to constantly wrong foot the audience. The rhythm of change often takes its cues from handbrake turns that you have to pull the audience around with nothing but a sound and a shift in movement and a light. MIDI is vital. You can make an audience lean in so you can push them away or wrong foot them. Just be bossy. The fourth point and story I wanted to talk about was points of tension or risk. Follies, one of my most recent collaborations at the National Theatre, was designed by Vicky Mortimer. Her design was composite, a revolving broken wall. Dominic Cook, the director, was very clear that the piece was both literal and metaphorical. The derelict theatre is ever present. The ghosts of the glories of the past are there too. The ghosts push against reality till they take over, revealing the disillusionment, the sad truth of aging, from the dreams of youth to the dull sadness of the truth of now. Can you imagine being 20 and beautiful and really seeing your 55-year-old self? Perhaps it was the perfect piece for me. Oh, let's see if I can. So there are layers that I had to create. The now was the derelict space of 1971, something abandoned, things left behind, including lights, and the lights of the building site, the layers of light added to make the space temporary. Then the lights that the MC character in the play has rigged up to make the event feel festive, the Follies sign, as if it's been powered up again, broken but still beautiful. And then the ghost world, the world where Folly's girls and grease paint and tap shoes existed, the world of Garbo and Josephine Baker, of tungsten bulbs around mirrors and scoops. And finally, the world that the imagination takes you as the whole thing breaks down, deconstructs. And each one of these ideas has to feel strong enough that the visual tension between them is interesting, is resonant, that it tells the story of the piece in the same way that the text and the songs do, that it keeps an audience engaged for the 2 hours, 15 minutes that it plays with no interval. And so often it feels like a review, but we were determined to give each moment a dramaturgical sense of why it was there, what its relationship is to both the now and the then. Have the ghosts got control of this one or not? If we can make the tension alive, then the piece can be a conversation, a constant push and pull to the final moments when the ghosts take over and the space transforms to become something new, shared. In the same way that a good story is difficult to second guess what might happen, but so well written and clear that that isn't scary but is interesting, so risk in lighting can make for much more interesting work. I often feel that things are more interesting if they are underlit, also if the work includes things that you aren't sure will work, but also that are new. This was very much the case with Ear for Eye at the Royal Court. We wanted to try setting the piece in a perspex box, so when the audience entered, they could see nothing but the box full of smoke. When it lifted, the piece took place underneath it. Who knew you could put so much smoke in a contained space that no light would cut through it? That's a VL1000 pointing down in that image. But how could we contain the smoke? How much smoke would we need, and how on earth would we light the rest of the piece? That gives you an idea. And then the fifth element of story I wanted to talk about, because it's something I feel very close to, is character. Clearly, character is central to any story. Much of what we've been looking at up until now could be described as the character of the light, what it's doing, what it is, what it looks like. But I also thought there's an element of character about our work that's different, and that's how we show a performer and how we can find ways to reflect their state with light. Moments when the light and the performer become one, where we can help heighten the sense of them. So this is Joelle Harvey being stalked by Sarah Connolly's Cesare in the opera Juliet Cesare at Glyndebourne. The harsh crosslight on Sarah spilling onto Joelle lets us see her relative to him. And then crushing Anne-Marie in Heisenberg as the inevitability of her relationship crushes her. So too did the set as the light got brighter and harsher. Tracy Bennett in Follies singing I'm Still Here as her younger self looks on, the audience constantly referring to the now and the then. In the same show, the follow spot finding Hattie again as she remembers what it was to perform Broadway Baby 30 years earlier. Prior Walter trapped in his own loneliness, surrounded by darkness, while Harper lets her fears take her to Fantasyland and Antarctica, both from Angels in America. Vicky in Red Shoes by Matthew Bourne, literally put into the spotlight by Lermontov. Christopher from Curious Incident, being a detective lit by his torch, only after a little training as to how to use the bounce from his letter, the only light on. Hans Sachs, the morning light revealing what he must do in Act 3 of Meistersinger. Tamara Rojo alone in the TV as an image of contemporary solitude. Anne-Marie Duff again, this time in St. Joan, being tortured in a production. The vast auditorium, an empty space, and the most brutal light I could find. And one of the women of Troy, imprisoned in a harsh industrial warehouse, waiting. So we're reaching the end of the story, at which point I move on to the end. And the end of this story is a plea for the future. And there are a few things I want to ask you to do. The first is to think about story, to think about those neuroscientists and psychologists who are starting to realise that story is vital to our existence, is vital to create effective communication. If you aren't using story to communicate, then you aren't communicating well. And I mean this about everything we do. What's the point of a light if we don't know what story it can tell? What quality does it contain? What is this conversation for? Because the most amazing thing about light is what you can do with it, the story you can tell. The second thing I want to ask of all of you is to start actively questioning your prejudices. It is incredibly hard for young women and other marginalised communities to find a welcome home in our industry. It's almost impossible to be taken seriously and to find ways to be able to make mistakes. We need safe spaces. Ask yourself what your companies can do to become safer and more friendly towards those who aren't necessarily often seen in certain roles. And I don't mean passive or token gestures. How can you support emerging artists, emerging practitioners? How can you support women wanting to go back to work after they've had children? How can you really shift the racial bias throughout your companies? What new models can you offer? And what biases do you carry without even being aware that you're carrying them? Because I assure you that you are. We all do. Do some radical and detailed soul searching. Ask the questions you haven't been willing to ask and stop accepting what is considered the norm. I'm bored of being in a minority, and a rich and diverse mix of people makes for a surprising and better workplace, I assure you. And finding role models is hard. That's one of the reasons I'll do things like this, terrifying though it is. I have a moral responsibility to speak up for my gender and for me being able to achieve excellence, for shifting perceptions, for showing it is possible, but also for showing it's possible without denying my female self. So for that, I'm hugely grateful to you all for offering me this opportunity. And the third thing is, without question, the most important, and I'm talking about our climate crisis. Every one of us in this room has to take responsibility for where we are and has to make radical changes to the way we live. We need to exert pressure and we need to offer changes as an industry. As the recent Safe Stage lighting campaign revealed, if we don't, then we'll be punished with legislation that is well-meaning but misguided. We should be leading the charge for change in the whole lighting industry. We have to stop believing that more is more, that lots is good, that filling our lives and our TV screens with more of everything is better. Good design is about simplicity and well-made choices. So bring sustainable practice into your own personal practice, whatever your role, and stop waiting for someone else to do it or assuming that it will all be okay, because it won't. And then the last thing I have to make a plea for is, of course, in the current climate, for my sector, for the world of the performing arts and the freelancers who work within it. It's a massive conversation that would take an hour to talk about now, but please take an interest, try and find out, and try and be champions for us all, because we're incredibly vulnerable at the moment. So my summary would be, in terms of the sustainability argument, let's just use less, or this story won't have an ending that any of us will be happy to see. And thank you.
Thank you for a great talk, Paule. To begin the questions, I would like to ask a question about televising theatre shows. This question I first put to Bernie Davis when he gave this talk a few years ago, but he answered it from the other way round. What I'd like to say is that from a live audience in an auditorium, the dynamic range of their eyes is much greater than that of a camera, and therefore the lighting has to be slightly augmented for the cameras to see it the way the audience did. How do you feel about someone adding to your lighting in that way?
Hi, Peter. I just wanted to take a moment to respond to your question about filmed material and how I feel about that relationship, which was brought about through Bernie giving this talk a couple of years ago. I've been very privileged to work with Bernie on several occasions, and the thing that I find so exceptional about him is that he is incredibly respectful and engaged with the live work that we've created. So he never takes an easy option. He always takes a kind of opportunity to find creative ways of approaching what is our work, and likes to trust things being dark, being high contrast, all the things that I would have assumed in the past that somebody doing his job would not want, but in theatre we do want. So he's incredibly good at capturing the essence of what we had in the live event. I also wanted to tell a story about a situation when we filmed Billy Budd at Glyndebourne for broadcast, and the lighting cameraman on that production wasn't Bernie, it was Majid, but the production started in darkness, and the kind of concept behind the production is that out of the darkness this figure appears behind a gauze, and that then as this figure kind of walks into the space sort of floating in crosslight, that what looms behind him is an entire interior of a man of war, a ship. So the idea is conjured, the whole show was conjured from Veer's subconscious really, so it's darkness, he appears, from him and his singing, the ship appears. And Majid did something very, very, very beautiful, which is as the music started in the broadcast, we just had a blank screen. It wasn't the orchestra playing, it wasn't a title, it was just blank. So that as in the real live production, as Mark appeared out of the darkness, they trusted that enough to let the first sound sit in darkness and then for Mark to appear out of it. So I think there's also a kind of, sometimes it's wonderful when, I think you wouldn't necessarily choose to do that if you were making a film of Billy Budd, but it felt incredibly respectful and generous to keep the spirit of what we'd done and make it part of the final version. So like anything, it's good collaboration, isn't it?
So we have been receiving questions throughout. We have one here from Kevin Shaw. So how do you feel about photography of your work, as it is so much a dynamic feel and meant for the human eye? The camera's freezing in time and change of perceived concept does change the experience.
Hello, Kevin. I completely agree with you. And in a funny sort of way, I always feel it's a bit of a cheat when I'm showing images of my work, because actually most of what a good image of a show does is celebrate the art of the photographer rather than my work. Their ability to capture a moment, but also some of the most exciting moments that I think I've ever created in a theatre would be impossible to be caught on film, because they're really playing with levels of darkness that cameras would struggle with. So they are a record of things that we've made, because actually one of the things about stage lighting is there's no real record of it. You know, how do we capture the kind of smell of the light that we've made? So I have huge respect for the people who do that job well and who can capture a moment, and it's a very rare skill. And yes, it's more their skill than mine quite often, I think, is my feeling about that.
Yeah, it's amazing. Some of the images included in your presentation were astounding as well, really brilliant. It's quite the skill. Okay, the next question is from David Hollingsworth, and he says this is amazing, so that's a nice start. And he asks, what are the range of light sources are generally used now with the advent of LED?
Thank you, David, for being so positive. It's really, it's very bizarre talking to my own laptop in my own front room. So that's lovely to get some feedback. It's really interesting, the question of LED technology and its development within the theatre. I redesigned the new version of Les Mis about 10 years ago when they did a tour for the 25th anniversary, actually. And when we first put that show together, it was, I think we still had VL 3500, so it was a little bit of discharge, and the rest of the show was essentially tungsten. As that show's evolved and had many different versions, and finally it's now the version that was running in the West End until we all had to leave, that show is now 90% LED. but it still has the look of the tungsten show that we originally made. And interestingly, the only units that we don't have a replacement for are the VL3500s. So we are using Encores where we used to use Revolutions and TW1s. We're using a GLP unit where we were using 5Ks, which was a real revelation to me. I really didn't think we'd be able to get the sort of grandeur of and the softness of a 5K, but they've done a brilliant job. And we are using the new VL8, the 800, it's terrible, I keep forgetting the name of lights because I'm not using them at the moment, but the new event par, the VL, where we had parkans and scrolls before, and of course lusters where we had profiles and scrolls before. So it's interesting that we've got a very tungsten painterly quality show. Dave Isherwood from White Light went to see the show and said he would challenge anyone to identify that it was 85% tungsten LED, because it really does look tungsten. So there are many possibilities, but it often varies from show to show and what's available in a building. And you know, we shouldn't ignore the technology that we have. You know, it's not to say that LED technology is better. And I think what will be interesting to see with Les Mis is how the show deteriorates over time, and if it does. So we'll keep an eye on that, I hope, if we get a chance to see it again. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question we have is from Ruth Kelly-Waskett, who's also President-elect of the SLL. Hello, Ruth. So we have, she says, thank you, Paule, for an inspiring talk. I'd like to know your thoughts on what I see as one of the fundamental differences between theatre lighting and architectural lighting, which is that the latter is often defined by technical requirements, in particular lighting levels and distribution defined by standards, whereas theatre lighting appears to be joyfully unconstrained by quantitative demands. What can we learn from each other? It's a big one.
It is a huge one. I mean, I do feel that I'm very privileged to work in an area of lighting where I'm free to make decisions based on what I see, but actually what's really, I mean, I will admit that I do underlight every show I ever do. And I'm fortunate enough to work in lots of buildings where I work and have previews, so you can watch the show with an audience, see what works, what doesn't work on it the next day, try and improve it. I always spend most of the first preview kind of weeping because I'm so embarrassed that the lighting levels are so low that it feels like nobody understands what's going on, and you suddenly feel as the lighting designer you're responsible for everything that feels opaque. So while my judgment is based on what I see, it's also based on watching a show with an audience, obviously receiving notes from a director and a designer and a creative team, but also just feeling the sense of how the audience, I talked about this a bit in the talk, didn't I, about how they're leaning in or when they're sort of sitting back and things aren't clear. So it's not purely my own taste, although that's the point that I quite often start from. I mean, I think, yes, it must be very frustrating. And any time that I've had to, you know, I don't ever use a lux meter. I don't know what that is, you know, and I'm sure there's something that many people in your part of the industry are very bound by. But I think we can and should take care. And in a way, this is what I was trying to sort of allude to at the end, that I think there's something incredibly precious about light, and unfortunately the sort of technical and engineering and sort of safety demands of light in architecture can sometimes make it feel quite it's quite functional. But I think even I would imagine the challenge would be to make it functional but still remaining playful and dramatic. And I'm thinking about Spears and Major and, you know, work that I've, you know, times when you go into spaces like Terminal 5 in Heathrow and you go, wow, it really does feel different, because there's a kind of care and you can deliver it and deliver a drama, which I think is really good, which is why I think it's so lovely to be in this opportunity to talk about story relative to what I do, but I hope it might make some people who work in the sort of more architectural world think about story in their work and think about darkness, because we can control light. And you know, as you can tell from a lot of the images that I'm very drawn to, I love darkness. I love being in dark spaces. I love being on the edges of the landscape or in the mountains where you get very little light pollution. That thing about where darkness and light meet is so dramatic and brilliant, and trying to find more ways to spend time in that space in our urban environments, for instance, I think is really interesting. So I think it's easy for me to say it, but I would say encouraging you to challenge yourself to find the darkness as well as the necessary light would be quite interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I think that idea of bringing story in, and you mentioned the kind of active participatory engagement would be a very useful tool within architectural lighting as well. The next question we have is from Chris Dix, and he says, thank you for a really interesting talk. Would you mind listing again the 5 elements you covered and telling the story?
Absolutely. So I sort of, one is character. I mean, now this means I'm going to have to try and find my notes, and they're all over the place. But so character, points of tension or risk, theme and style, plot, and then the first one is, it's not right. I'll talk about it else for a brief moment and I'll find it, because I've been throwing pieces of paper on the floor of my sitting room. So points of tension.
There will be there will be a recording available, which we'll send out after the webinar. So if we need to find that last point, we can.
Carry on, give me another question, and if there is another one. No.
Yeah, we do. So we've got one from Roshan Thomas, who asks, as a beginner for theatre lighting, what are the standards we should follow for such lighting?
What are the standards? Oh, that's a really interesting. As a beginner, I would say just always keep an eye on what story you're trying to tell. So, and I also think with theatre lighting, it's this is a really kind of really glib thing to say in some ways, but it's very easy to end up adding more and more light, and it can all get quite muddy. And if you're trying, the first thing to do if someone says to you that they can't see something clearly on stage is look at the stage and take away the light where you don't need it, rather than adding more light. I think it's because I think in quite high contrast, but I think it's always better to take away rather than add, because every time you add, you're kind of making an idea or an image less clear. And I sort of think, because I quite like big, bold images, and I think that the more you create something that's bold and clear, even if it's quite risky, what happens is people feel engaged by it, and they're sort of happy to go with the risk because it feels worth it, because it feels alive and interesting. So what can ruin that is ending up with too much light and it's not clear what you're looking at. So if in doubt, take light away, and it will help to sharpen up that sense of what you're really looking at and what the image really is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. Thank you. So the next one we have is from Nadia Roxburgh, and she asks, how do we find the balance between video and light in theatrical performance?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, ultimately, it's about good collaboration. So I think it's important as soon as a video is a major element in a production, and usually that's going to come in through the kind of design process. But I think being part of the conversation as to what the function of the video is really critical, because then there's an understanding as to whether you're, it again comes down to the story. It's what its function is in the room. Is it to be pictorial? Is it to be gestural? Is it for the emotional or the literal landscape? Is it something that and then the light that it creates, how are you going to light in a way that makes those two things work together? So for example, with Warhorse, that torn cloud was always projected onto, and we had lots of haze, and normally with projection people would find that quite difficult, but because that kind of gesture, it was part of a layer of storytelling rather than going, this is the story. It wasn't all carried by that. It was like, that was just an element of lots of things that created this composite image. That meant that we could sort of soften its edges and just push it away a little bit. And we it was really dark, the projection, so the light could be more present and the horses could be more present. So it's about balance as any light source on stages, and it's always also asking that question of what are you looking at? You know, you do that thing of the squint test, and if you're doing the squint test and the brightest thing you can see is the projection, that's fine if it's the thing that's carrying the story then, but if it's the thing that wants to be embedded into a whole other conversation, then you need to look at the balance. So I think you have to treat it as you would any surface. I think also it's really important to engage with what the projection surface is, because sometimes, like for example, if you've got a big white screen and it's being projected on, it is a great big white plastic thing in the middle of the space. There's no getting away from that, and you sort of need to ask the question of what is it if it's not being projected on, and if it's being projected on all the way through, then the shifts, are they being carried by the projection screen and the projection content, and then you're responding, or your job is to be more passive. It's kind of passing a baton in a way. You know, like with Curious Incident, we were projecting onto a black surface, which is not what a projection designer would necessarily want to be using, but it was very crisp and vivid because the light was really controlled and the sort of whole space was immersive. So it felt like there were times when people couldn't tell what was projection and what was lighting, which I was really happy about. So I think, yeah, it's just good collaboration, as with everything, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so we have a question now from Alan Mooney, who asks, so hearing you talk about your collaborative approach to work, it is obvious set and setting are huge influences. In Ireland, there are a funny trend of lighting designers becoming lighting and set designers. Would you ever consider delving into the world of set and lighting?
Absolutely not. I can barely cope with the amount of work. I mean, I think it's an interesting question because people, I think some people have a much bigger pictorial imagination and hunger than I have. And I love, I mean, you'll probably see from quite a lot of the images of the shows that I was sharing that I quite often work with the same people. I have like 5 or 6 very, very strong relationships with set designers and very, very strong relationships with the directors. And particularly with the set designers, I love that conversation. It's absolutely what feeds me. And I know that the way I think is reactive. You know, I love the sense of a director and designer going, we think this is how we're going to tell a story, and coming in and going, wow, that's brilliant, because if you're doing that, then I can bring that alive with light. It's like I'm immediately thinking to myself, what are the rules for the lighting? What does that mean? What does that mean? I don't want to be the person who has to generate that first response. That just doesn't feel like where my skill lies. I think my skill lies in articulating something that's becoming a thing And I think it's quite interesting. When I first started working in theatre, as I said, I worked with Theatre de Complicité, and I did a bit of production management for them, and I did a bit of prop making, and I did a bit of lighting design. And if we were warming up in the morning, I'd warm up with the company as with everybody else. And when they were improvising, we'd sort of join in with improvisations. The fact that ultimately my response was with light, that's the kind of element that I'm really in love with. But I don't feel the need to control or manage in that way. That I think if you're a set designer, you think in a very, very different way, and that's a different skill, and it's definitely a skill I haven't got.
That's really interesting to hear. Sort of the collaboration is a big part of the process as well, and I think that will apply to a lot of people working in lighting design and the work that they do alongside other disciplines. That's interesting.
Yeah. It's also about what you're good at, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it, I suppose, and where your passion lies. Yeah. And that ability to sort of feed off each other and each other's ideas. It's quite an exciting creative process.
My favourite bit.
Yeah. So the next question we have is from Fabienne Ledem, and he asks, have you ever used, or this is kind of along the similar line, but have you ever used your lighting, staging, storytelling skills to transform public realms and create unique experiences for users? And are you open to collaboration?
I never have. I'm very open to collaboration. I every now and again I've sort of had opportunities to kind of I did a little bit of work, for example, when they did the opera exhibition at the V&A. I did a bit of work for them on that, but it felt like such a kind of clash of, it's a little bit like Ruth's question early on. It felt like such a clash of whether light was considered sort of functional or whether it was considered a storytelling device. And I found the whole world of trying to respond to quantity surveyors and things like that completely debilitating. And also that the staff that I work with when I make a show are very much in the theatre. So I'll sort of collaborate with them through the development of ideas and things. And here I was just being asked to produce drawings and get loads of information. And it's the sort of thing that I would develop with a team normally. So I realized that my skills were not such that I could deliver what the V&A needed. And ultimately, in the end, I kind of gave the design to somebody who did work in that area, and he did a brilliant job delivering it. Because it's a very, very different language. I think given a situation where I wasn't on my own, as you say, where it would be collaborative and I could do the learning, I think would be very interesting, where you could sort of challenge. You know, what's interesting when you meet people who work in different disciplines, it's the commonality is fascinating, but also the gaps that we work with light, and it's so different. So I've always enjoyed those conversations when you're sort of learning about the differences, but also that, as with anything, any juxtaposition, that's where it becomes interesting. And I've only ever had an opportunity to panic about my lack of knowledge as opposed to explore it in a way. So yes, collaborating around that would be interesting, definitely.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting way to put it. I'm sure lots of people feel the same. That sort of, you realise the lack of knowledge when it's the kind of panic stage. It's nice. Would be nice to have the opportunity to explore it as well.
To feel less ignorant in a way.
The next question is from Guy Konetsky, and he asks, Paule, your story is inspiring and your work continues to be amazing. What has been your favourite production and why?
Hello, Guy. I haven't heard from you for a very, very, very long time. How are you? What a lovely question. I did love Follies. I absolutely loved it because I felt that I was the right age to be doing that piece. I felt I really understood it. I I think that one of the things that Sondheim is talking about that sense of a lived experience and the juxtaposition between the older and younger self, and the way he was articulating that through theatre and the metaphor of theatre and life was just brilliant. And Vicky, who designed it, is such a kind of, she's been such a kind of important part of my developing as an artist. I think Vicky Mortimer and Ray Smith are the two people who I have learned the most from. And Ray designed Warhorse, for instance. So I think it probably is Follies, also because Follies has an element of music about it. And I do love working with music. And I think I love working with music, not necessarily in a kind of music. I find music, a lot of musical theatre quite, it doesn't, I'm not the right person to be working on it. Les Mis is different because it's sung through and it's quite operatic. Anything where you've got numbers, and I find there's lots of people who do that sort of work brilliantly, like Hugh Vanstone and people like that, and I just go and see his work and I'm like, I could never do that, because I'm sort of looking for the sort of underbelly of something rather than how to sort of celebrate it in that way. So Follies has music, but in that kind of operatic way. It has a score. It's just exceptional, and it does have to have numbers. There's mirror mirror and things in it, so you did have to do a bit of kind of sort of slightly kind of sparkly festive lighting, but I did my particularly sort of my sort of stripped back version of that. So it would be Follies. I really loved the show that I mentioned, Ear for Eye, which was at the Royal Court. I loved making that very much. And then I suppose if I were to think of all the operas I've done, something like Death in Venice that I did at the Opera House last year, partly again because Vicky designed it and David McVicker directed it, who I've worked with for years, and I just think that's an exceptional score, and we achieved something really hard. Yeah, they're the best ones in the last few years. Much nicer to answer that question than all the ones that I have not been, where you just think I could, I mean, all work you do, you think you could do better and you could do more. And the other thing, of course, why I loved Follies is I got a second chance to do it because we revived it. So things that I discovered I could be bolder with the second time. So that also made it feel particularly sort of strong and special. So I think that was one of the better shows I've done. Yeah.
Thank you. That's interesting as well, getting the opportunity to go back after having sort of seen it in action and yeah, make any tweaks that you wanted to. So we'll take just a couple more questions. I know this is quite a grilling. We've had lots, which is brilliant. Thank you, everybody. So the next one is from Anthony Meadows, and he asks, you touched on this, but to what extent is lighting automatically controlled versus manually controlled at the moment?
So thanks, Anthony. The majority, I would say, it's very, very rare for us to do anything that's manually controlled, apart from follow spots if you're using them. So, and sometimes with the follow spots, we'll control the level through the desk, but still give the kind of pickups, the control of the sort of rhythm of the actor being picked up is still controlled by the operator. But the level that they sit at is quite often controlled by us, because again, because I tend to light things at quite low levels. I don't use spots very often, but sometimes I quite like to use them so they sort of embed into the picture rather than feeling overt. Follies or something, you'd use an overt follow spot, but you can use follow spots in quite a painterly way. But generally, every cue is recorded in the board, and the majority of shows that I've done, they're still called by a stage manager. So with something like Curious Incident, there are times when we're triggered by sound, but 95% of the time with shows that I do, the cues are still a button press by a board operator, or a board operator making sure that the sound is triggering us at the right, when it should. And the cues are actually called by what we call a DSM in theatre, so the deputy stage manager who's following the script or following the score. It's very rare in theatre that we do anything that involves the manual fade. And I sometimes wonder about that, because I grew up in a world, certainly when I worked in rock and roll, everything was manual. So I did learn about crossfading and the way things moved, not quite in the 1950s manner of Jeannie Rosenthal, but not far from it. I'm very used to looking for bite points, and I do think it's a really useful learning tool to sort of see how moving a fader can make things respond in different ways, particularly when you're using tungsten fittings, less so with using LED, when we're quite often looking for sort of different curves and a little bit of help around the sort of journey of a light from nothing through to whatever percentage you want it to be at. Of course, that's a massive part of the conversation, that that's so much of the work of a theatre lighting designer is rhythm of change and levels and painting in a way that's rare, I think, in the architectural world, as far as I'm aware, except for if you're having shifting images through days or something. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take one more question now. There's also, I will make sure to send these through to you afterwards, but there's a lot of really wonderful comments from people as well, so I'll make sure those are sent through.
And do send through any questions as well, if anybody wants to ask anything specific. I'm more than happy to respond.
Fantastic, will do. So we have the final question from David Stewart, who says, fascinating seminar, Paule. How do you go about choosing your colour palettes? Do you go out of your boundary and experiment with colour?
I try with every show I do to base the palette on research, but I also really do have habits. I know that. So I think in Lee 202, that's, or with every show that I do, I kind of set where my kind of my baseline is, and quite often it's 202, sometimes it's 203. And it's funny with using LED fixtures that I still think in terms, I think in Lee, that's just how I grew up. But I do always try and take them back to research ideas. And I try, if I'm ever doing, I try with every show I do to try new colours. I don't tend to think in saturated colours unless I'm doing something that's really self-conscious. It's not, I'm much more interested in kind of real small shifts in kind of colour temperature. So kind of between warm and white and cool and white. So my sort of classic sort of, it's a 200 through to 206 is kind of, my favourite area, and all those things like 213 and those kind of slight off greens. Partly because that's a lot of images that I'm drawn to. I get lots of my ideas from real situations, or from people like Gregory Crewdson and people like that. I love looking at photographic images and filmic images, even though No Country for Old Men, the majority of the kind of brilliant colour in that was post-production, but even so, what it does, the light quality and where they push that to is amazing. So that sort of movie took me through this whole kind of slight obsession with yellow for a while. But yeah, I try to make, but I most production electricians would say that if I gave them a plan, they could guess what colours I was going to put on it. But yes, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for listening to the lecture. I'd like to thank Paule one last time for giving such a great talk. And there will be a recording of this coming out in the next couple of days, along with questions that may not have been answered that you'll be able to see at the same time. I'd like to thank Andrew Beardsmore for allowing us to be here this afternoon. And thank you very much, and good afternoon.